Hey guys, this is Spiegelman. I'm back on this channel for the first time in a long time. If you guys didn't see, I released a short film a few weeks back. Thanks for all the support on that. That's a cool project that I'm pretty happy with, and then I'll also have some other stuff kind of in that lane coming out here soon. But in addition to that, I kind of wanted to use this channel for a little bit more than just my filmmaking stuff that I have going on right now. There's also a lot of things that I love and that I find interesting or find important that I really want to make time to talk about. And so I want to kind of use this as a way to talk about those things. And this video today is going to be no different. I'm going to be talking about the story of the fight between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, which took place in the pre-World War II landscape. When I found out about this story, which we'll get into the specifics of that a little bit later, I was just kind of staggered by, one, how I wasn't aware of it, but also just so kind of enthralled in kind of this, something that almost sounds kind of mythological, and a story that's kind of on a scale of something that we haven't really seen in modern, or rather more recent times. And it's kind of the intersection of a lot of these different interests that I have, and also kind of tying into that short film Shadow Boxing that I just released. You know, this is a story about boxing. It's a story about history, particularly surrounding World War II. It's just a really interesting story that I think a lot of people can get a lot from. And it also connects to kind of a piece of art that is yet to be created that I hope I get to see sometime soon. So today I'm just gonna kind of be going through that whole story, through everything that surrounded it, and kind of where that brings us now, and ultimately what brought me to this story. And I'm also going to publish this story in text format. I originally kind of wrote about it in almost an article form. You can find that link down below as well, if you prefer to read it that way, or share it with others that way. So yeah, let's get started with this pretty incredible story that I think a lot of people will find something in to really be captivated by. If you're someone who doesn't really have any particular interest in boxing or any connection to it, that's not something that you're going to need to be able to have any value taken out of this story. But what you might need is kind of an introduction to kind of the character, the ethos of Joe Louis as he was as an incredible heavyweight boxing champion. So I'm going to go through kind of some of his history and then how that led us to kind of this crazy story that I've been alluding to up until this point. Joe Louis was born on May 13th, 1914 in Chambers County, Alabama, and he was the seventh of 8 children. We share a birthday, actually. His family lived in poverty, and both of his parents were children of former slaves. His father was a sharecropper, which was a really common occupation for generations of Black Americans following the abolition of slavery, and his mother was a laundress. But his father was committed to a mental institution when he was 2 years old, and his mother remarried. In 1926, kind of in response to a lot of the violence that was being acted upon by the Ku Klux Klan against Black Americans in the South, the Louis family moved to Detroit, and that was kind of a part of this larger movement known as the Great Migration, which was this mass migration of Black Americans northward following World War I to flee a lot of the oppression that they were facing in the American South. Kind of the classic fable as to how Joe Louis got introduced to boxing was that his mom had signed him up for violin lessons once they got to Detroit, but his classmate introduced him to boxing, and he spent the money that he was meant to be spending on his violin lessons on boxing classes. Joe Louis's real full name is actually Joseph Louis Barrow, but he actually dropped his last name for his fighting moniker because he wanted to hide his boxing from his mother, since she had thought that, you know, he was going to his violin lessons instead. And he quickly rose through the ranks in the amateurs, and was just kind of immediately almost a phenom just for how fast and hard he could hit. By the end of his amateur career, he had a record of 50-4 with 43 knockouts. For those not familiar with boxing, that ratio of wins to knockouts is pretty staggering. That just means that This guy was hitting hard enough to where the vast majority of the opponents that he faced just couldn't last. And he was immediately successful once he went the professional route. He ended up partnering with a manager named John Roxborough, and a lot of people would credit Roxborough for kind of the rise to fame and popularity that Joe Louis had, because he kind of outlined a very specific image for Joe, so that he could kind of avoid a lot of the negative stereotypes that were being placed upon the preceding black fighters. There's a lot more information regarding that that you can read about in the articles that I've listed below, where I pulled a lot of the information for this video. The African American History Museum was probably my greatest resource for writing this, but overall, Roxborough just kind of advised Joe Louis to present himself as a really modest, respectful young man, just to avoid a lot of those negative images. As Louis kind of rose to this meteoric level of success, he almost occupied this sort of symbolic role in the black community specifically. He became kind of this symbol of excellence in the black community, and he kind of represented the idea that black people's excellence could rise them to some semblance of equality just based off of their own merit and their own skill and their own intelligence. And that symbol of strength was just incredibly important during that time. Segregation and racial violence were about as prominent as they ever have been during this period. You know, it's hard to even put into words how much this man as a symbol really meant to various communities, but I think that it's kind of best summed up by what is now kind of a common myth, but really kind of displays a lot of the issues of the time. This is famously told by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his book titled Why We Can't Wait. This is a quotation from that. Quote, "More than 25 years ago, one of the southern states adopted a new method of capital punishment. Poison gas supplanted the gallows. In its earliest stages, a microphone was placed inside the sealed death chamber so that scientific observers may hear the last words of the dying prisoner to judge how the human reacted to this novel situation. The first victim was a young black man. As the pellet dropped into the container and the gas curled upwards, through the microphone came these words, 'Save me, Joe Louis.'" That story has been not directly necessarily disproven. There's some that would assert that it's kind of a variation on a real series of events. There's a particular 2005 LA Times article that's written by David Margolick that kind of connects it to the real life story of a black man named Alan Foster. I'll be linking that article below for those interested in reading. But that is the level of symbolism that Joe Louis embodied. So this kind of takes us to the particular story that we're here to talk about today, setting the scene for where we are in history at this point. So the year is 1936, and Joe Louis is undefeated. He's got a 27-0 record, and he's gearing up for his title shot. Needs no introduction that in 1936, overseas in Germany, Hitler has already risen to power. The Nazi regime has been established, and their rhetoric and propaganda is spreading rapidly. You know, that of course includes Hitler's ideology of this Aryan master race, and he's kind of seeking ways to prove this ideology to the people of Germany, kind of as it ideologically shifts in that post-World War I Treaty of Versailles landscape. This brings us to the other fighter in this story, whose name is Max Schmeling. Max Schmeling was a German boxer, and he was a former champion of the heavyweight division. And he would go on to fight Joe Louis on June 19th, 1936. It's been said that Joe Louis's team kind of saw this as something of a warm-up for his upcoming title shot, which was against James J. Braddock. But in a miraculous turn of events, Joe Louis was finished in the 12th round. He lost to Max Schmeling. Hitler immediately weaponized Schmeling's victory as a display of this Aryan superiority. What's kind of important to note, though, is that Schmeling was not a member of the Nazi Party, and he did not subscribe to fascist ideology directly. There's even evidence that he continued to work with his Jewish American trainer, Joe Jacobs, and also reportedly sheltered 2 young Jewish boys from the Gestapo in 1938. So Schmeling himself was not the agent of this propaganda. It's rather his image as a white male who had defeated this prominent black boxer was weaponized by the Nazi regime in order to spread their ideology of the Aryan master race. Despite Schmeling's victory, he wasn't allowed to have another title shot at this time. And so Lewis still got the title shot that he'd been training for. And he fought James J. Braddock on June 22nd, 1937, and finished him in the 8th round, becoming the heavyweight champion of the world. That being said, despite becoming heavyweight champion and on paper being the greatest heavyweight fighter in the world at that time, there was still kind of that looming battle between him and Schmeling. Lewis even reportedly said, quote, "I don't want to be called a champ until I whip Max Schmeling." And that kind of goes into the event itself, which is the second fight, Max Schmeling versus Joe Louis II. This fight came to kind of directly represent the warring ideologies of American democracy and German fascism at the time. It didn't only represent that political battle, it also represented the ideological battle between the idea of equal races and the idea of there being a master race. Hitler would almost have a box to stand on if Schmeling were to defeat Lewis. He could tell the German people, look at this event, this is a display that the white race is superior to all the others. This fight's scale in the ideological sense grew to such an extent that there were people who genuinely believed that the winner of this fight would decide who would win in the coming conflict between America and Germany that would ultimately turn into World War II. That is the scale that this fight reached among the people of the world. Everyone had their eyes on this fight. And it's important to note, this is the time period of the radio. Everyone's tuned in, everyone's watching at home. These central events that in hindsight seem small relative to what we now know of these massive grand conflicts related to these wars were so important. You know, these things came to represent the conflict in ways that we don't really see anymore because we don't consume things in that mass way, in the same way that we used to. And I think that it's a really almost hard to comprehend just how large of an event that this came to be. Just to put in perspective how important this was to the people of America and Germany, Lewis visited FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, at the White House as he prepared for the fight. Roosevelt reportedly felt Lewis's bicep and said, quote, "Joe, we need muscles like these to defeat Germany." On the other end, Schmeling reportedly received a phone call from Hitler right before the fight, encouraging him to win for Germany. On the night of the fight, the world's watching. They're on the brink of total war, and people feel that this fight might determine the outcome of that conflict. The bout took place on June 22nd, 1938 at Yankee Stadium before a sold-out crowd of 70,000 people. Around 100 million people tuned into the fight by radio around the world, the largest for a single event ever up until that point. When that bell rang, a bout of almost religious significance began. Joe Louis knocked down Max Schmeling 3 times in the first round before the referee stopped the fight at 2 minutes and 8 seconds. The events of this fight definitively disproved Nazi ideology, and it humiliated Hitler. And it encouraged Americans of all backgrounds that their strength could overcome the growing power of the Nazi regime. Despite this victory against Nazi ideology and Nazi Germany, it's important to note that the American response to it was laced in hypocrisy. I think that this is best summed up in a quote from Joe Louis. He said, quote, "White Americans, even while some of them were still lynching black people in the South, were depending on me to KO Germany." Joe Louis at this point had risen to a point where he was a role model to not only black Americans, but to Americans in general. And despite that, the core ideology of America stayed in contradiction to that. And that is kind of the saddest part about this story, that despite a black man coming to represent what America should be in 1938, that things wouldn't change. Despite kind of what this fight came to represent, Joe Louis and Max Schmeling actually went on to become really great friends. As I said before, Schmeling did not subscribe to the Hitlerian ideology that was kind of being placed upon the fight. And the two fighters kept in touch up until Joe Louis's death on April 12, 1981. Schmeling donated money to pay for his funeral. That story in its entirety kind of brings me back to how I discovered it and how it connects back to filmmaking. My favorite film of all time is Do the Right Thing. And that is a film, for those not familiar, that's written and directed by Spike Lee. Spike Lee is an incredibly successful filmmaker. His primary subject matters are Black American culture, their experiences, their history. He's also directed films like Malcolm X, She's Gotta Have It, more recently Black Klansman, which won Best Adapted Screenplay at the Oscars in 2019. And in addition to being an incredible filmmaker, he's kind of come to be a cultural icon, and his aesthetics have influenced fashion and culture and tons of other creatives. He's even a film professor at NYU Graduate Film School. Continuing down the ladder, Spike Lee's favorite film of all time is the 1954 film On the Waterfront, which was written by the screenwriter and novelist Bud Schulberg. Schulberg's other famous works include the novel What Makes Sammy Run and the 1956 boxing film The Harder They Fall. He was born on March 27, 1914 in New York City, about a month and a half before Joe Louis. He was a Jewish American and served in World War II as a field photographer. He reportedly witnessed the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. He was even involved in collecting evidence against the Nazis for the Nuremberg trials. Schulberg had a lifelong love for boxing, and a lot of his writing involved boxing as a subject matter and a theme. He wrote a lot of articles about boxing and compiled them into a 1995 book titled Sparring with Hemingway. He was inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame in 2002 for his contribution to the sport. Schulberg was actually present for both of the Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling fights. Bud Schulberg and Spike Lee would go on to meet, and they became great friends. They spoke about making a screenplay about the story of Joe Louis and Max Schmeling and everything it represented, from the history surrounding World War II to the Black American struggle. They would go on to write this screenplay, and they titled it Save Us, Joe Louis. Spike Lee and Schulberg repeatedly attempted to raise the funds to produce the film, but unfortunately the film could not be realized before Bud Schulberg's death on August 5th, 2009. Spike Lee made a promise before Schulberg's death to get the film made and plans to keep it to this day.
I was very fortunate to meet Bud Schulberg. Me and Bud were tight, and Bud took an interest in me, and we talked about writing. And in fact, we wrote a script together called Save Us, Joe Louis. It's about the friendship between Max Schmeling and Joe Louis. It's an epic film, and he was at those two Joe Louis Schmeling fights. The first one, Schmeling knocked out Joe Louis, but the second fight, it was widely thought that whoever won this fight would determine the winner of World War II. And it stars FDR, Hitler, Eleanor Roosevelt, Goebbels, Sugar Ray Robinson. I mean, it's an epic. And during Bud's last year, he called me once a week saying, Spike, did you get the money yet? Spike, did you get the money yet? And I made a promise to Bud that one day, soon, that we get the money. And I'm going to keep that promise and get that film made. It's a great script. It was wonderful working with Bud.
For me personally, I don't know if I could dream up a concept that connects the things that I care about more. I think that it represents the way that we have been as a society and is very important to have as perspective from where we are as an American society today. And I think it would be a tragedy to lose a story like this to time, especially because even somebody like me who loves boxing, loves film, and loves history didn't know about it until a few weeks ago. I really hope that you guys found this video informational and interesting. I hope you're there with me in the theater when this film eventually comes out. If you want to see more from me, if you haven't already seen my short film shadowboxing that's on my profile, there'll be more short films coming out soon and more videos like this. So thank you guys for supporting and watching, and I'll see you guys soon.